conversation. Cassandra, you're good to start. Matt, you're good to start. Andrew, Shatine, thumbs up. Okay, if you're not one of those four, if you could mute your mics, that would be fantastic. Excellent. I'm just going to do a brief introduction, and then we'll jump right into the conversation. Hopefully, everyone, I'll assume you're similar to my students, and of course, completed all your pre-course reading in advance. So I'm sure you're well versed on the difference between brand and reputation and identity and all those other factors. But today we're going to focus on a big theme from, sorry, Jasmine. All right, I'll try to avoid swaying. We're going to focus on a major theme that emerged from the first session on the first panel. That was this question of reality versus reputation. And obviously, for the last month, I've had the benefit of working with Kennedy and Anne-Marie Dorland from Mount Royal around this question of what's the role of reputation, what's the role of brand, and what's the role of identity in influencing the attraction, retention, and development of young mobile talent, and going deep on that question. So today, I have the benefit of being able to build a great panel of people who are experts in that in this area, and have have a strong opinion in that area, which is almost as good as being an expert. The first is Cassandra. So Cassandra McCauley, of course, is with Tourism Calgary. As anyone that had an opportunity to dive into the working paper, and Cassandra will certainly talk about this, Tourism Calgary has spent a considerable amount of time over the last 3 years, 3 to 4 years, unpacking this question of Calgary's brand and reputation in partnership with Calgary Economic Development. And digging into a whole lot of research in this area. And it provides a key foundation to actually start understanding the attributes of our brand, both how it's perceived locally and how it's perceived outside of Calgary. Then we have Matt Stone. So Matt, of course, is with Stone Olofsson. I've had the pleasure of working with Matt for the last probably 3 years now on a variety of different projects that are wrapped in and around there. And both Matt and Cassandra are advisors to the City X Lab. And so Matt has been leading one of a really fascinating study over the last 12 months that has focused it's an Alberta level study, but it's isolated data for Calgary to understand the impact of COVID on citizens' perception of re-engaging what we call the experience economy. And that experience has worked with CED and other partners, really brings a robust depth of background to this issue. Next, I'd like to introduce Shatine. So Shatine is is a student at the University of Calgary. And as everyone knows, the way these panels are structured is we try to balance mature perspectives and younger perspectives on these issues, because anyone who's a parent knows that we don't know much when it comes to our kids. So we like bringing in diverse youth perspectives of what exactly is happening on the ground. And that's one of the reasons when we looked at the development of the paper in the first paper, we had many young people involved in the development of those papers, because the last thing we needed is a bunch of old people pretending we know what we're talking about. So thanks, Shatine, for joining us today. And I'd like to, Andrew, where's Andrew? I'd like to introduce Andrew. So Andrew is involved with Calgary on Purpose, and I guess your day job, Andrew, is Apathy is Boring. And I had the benefit of engaging Apathy is Boring, which I want to get their mandate right, and I'll let Andrew talk to it, but it's really about mobilizing, engaging youth in the civic process, and making sure. One thing we talked about at the first session was, people are committed to their city and their community when they feel that they have a sense of ownership of it. And I just keep deferring back to the WestJet, we're owners too. And I think that's one of our greatest risks as a city, is people that just, the minute you become tuned out and you're not becoming an owner, you become vulnerable, and other places look like appealing options for you. So the ability to engage young people in the civic discourse across the city and actually defer to them rather than just putting just pretending we're listening rather than actually not listening is absolutely critical to this. So on that point, I want to thank our panelists, and I'm going to start with diving into a first question. And I'm going to target my first question at Matt. And I want to kind of deal with a real kind of basic technical question here, Matt, at the front end to kind of get us all up to speed. What is what is a brand? What is reputation? What is identity? How do these all fit together kind of at a macro, irrespective of the context, right? Because products, people, experiences all have brands and reputations, right? And then how does that then work operationally at a city level from your experience, Matt?
Wow, easy question to start us off with. I always view brands the same thing, whether it's corporate or civic or personality, because we all have our own brands as well. But it is that nexus between what we believe in and what we stand for. It's the experiences that we deliver. So for a person, what it's like to be with us. It's what other people say about us, our reputation. And then it's also what we say about ourselves. And at the core of that is our brand and the reputation, and all of those things have to align. And I think that's one of the things I found so cool about your question is, I think at the crux of this, do we have alignment on all the things that we want about our city to drive a good reputation and solve one of the challenges that we're facing? So for a community, what I find interesting about this and applying a brand to Calgary as an example is we have experiences here that we all know and love. Do other people in other markets feel the same way? Do they even know about them? Do they say that about us? Does that even align with what we say we want, right? It's an interesting challenge in our community where we have always said we want a more diverse economy, yet we are quick to go back to the energy, oil and gas well, right? So I think this time around it feels different, but, and then how we go out into the community and what we say about ourselves, and all the recent efforts by Tourism Calgary and Calgary Economic Development and others to market us are all creating, are circling around this challenge. So I think it's really about alignment of all of those different factors. What you stand for, what you experience, what you say, and what other people say.
So Cassandra, let me ask you a question on building on Matt's concept of this kind of building block model of, the brand DNA of the authenticity of it versus the projection of it versus the interpretation of it or the perception of it. What's interesting with the city of Calgary is its transformation, right? Just pure basic data on almost doubling the population over 2 decades. Incredible diversification of the population over 2 decades. So many parts of our kind of brand DNA, the kind of foundational components, are transforming so quickly. How does a city, right? It's difficult in a brand or a corporate context where I control all the levers of my brand, right? How does a city deal with a brand that's in a product that's in such transformation? So you in fact can be ahead in projecting the authenticity of today, not the reality of 2 or 3 decades ago.
Yeah, no, it's a great point, David. And I think the other element to that is throw in a pandemic and how that has changed the city, and we have even more that we're thinking about there. I think that some of the interesting things, as we think about all those elements that you talked about, the population growth, the change in the population, and the change in our city, it's that kind of going back to what Matt was talking about the experiences, and how do we see those and how do we project those too, right? And sometimes there has been a narrative of Calgarians not feeling connected to the city, and sometimes I wonder how much of a self-fulfilling prophecy that is, as opposed to the other way around. And so I think that we are very connected. I think one of the things that we obviously have a lot of challenges in that, and we've seen that through many other things, but one of the opportunities that we have with the pandemic and all of its effects are that we are forced to spend more time locally and to get to know our city in a different way that we haven't had that true opportunity in a long time, if ever, to really be centered in your city and experience it in a different way than you ever have, because you can't go anywhere else.
And so you're raising a good point in the sense that, direct engagement with a product or experience is critical to forming that opinion, because if you don't, you defer to kind of third-party perceptions or translations, right? And so all of a sudden we've got, we've got a huge proportion of young people that, and I'll take my two sons who normally would be at UVic and in Toronto respectively studying, are now here, experiencing the city, quote unquote, whatever you can do within the context of a pandemic, which involves primarily PlayStation, I think, and gaming. But anyways, and they're here, so they have an opportunity to kind of engage and experience. So some of the data point, I'm going to go to Andrew on this question, because one of the things I know fundamentally around, you from a belief perspective is great civic brands, great brands are never about top down, right? I'm not going to tell you how great our city is or how great our product is. In fact, it's organic, right? So if you look at great global brands, it's about advocates, and it's about people believing passionately in their product, and then it's them telling others about how amazing it is. So Andrew, let me ask you about that, about the challenge of building brand advocates, and the challenge of people believing in the assets of the city and then becoming advocates of that asset. How is, in your world, especially with apathy is born, how do we turn people into storytellers?
I think they need to believe in their own place, right? I know, not from the apathy is boring perspective, from the Calgary on Purpose perspective, where we've been listening to Calgarians talk about the city for over a year now. And there's a constant tug of war between people who love the Stampede, don't love the Stampede. I joke that I've become a Calgarian because I left the city for Stampede. And I know that's a common thing that lots of different people say. So do you love it or do you not? Is it part of what we are or is it not, right? I think, and some people say because we're becoming so diverse, this whole Western heritage Stampede thing is no longer relevant or less and less relevant. But on the flip side of that is the people who come here, they want to experience that. It's like, so they know that it's such a Calgary thing that they want to be part of it. Like they want to say, I got my hat on, I got my boots, I'm Calgarian, right? I'm going to go to a pancake breakfast. I'm going to go and ride the whatever rides, and I'm going to check out the rodeo. So we have this thing where people can't embrace fully what Calgary is. It's one thing or another, and I think they feel like we can't be more than just one thing. We can certainly be oil and gas, and we can certainly be tech and diverse economy, and we can certainly be Stampede and also multi-ethnic. So my cat wants that, but yeah, that's what I'm thinking there. We just need people to embrace it and really live it.
So Shati, let me ask you, so from your lens, this tension is really interesting in regards to past, present, and future. And I've always struggled because I've always said, and I think Senator Matt, given your backgrounds, you'd appreciate that every city in the world would love to have a Calgary Stampede, right? Because it's that signature asset that literally you're sitting somewhere in the world and you say Calgary Stampede and there's that vague brand awareness. I've heard of that, right? And you don't have that same resonance with other things. That's where the Stampede just does that signature heritage asset is a huge value to the city. Simultaneously, there's the risk of it amplifying some of the potential negatives, or at least risk negatives, amongst this younger cohort that we're all about looking backwards, not forward. So Shati, what's your take on that kind of fundamental balancing act of being able to leverage the history and the strength of Calgary in both, whether it be the energy sector, our Western heritage and so forth, as an asset, but simultaneously project a progressive city that the data suggests young mobile talent are looking to be part of?
Yeah, thank you. I think that that's actually like a really good point that you made. And I kind of want to build off of what Andrew said a little bit about like the Stampede. I think that like Calgary obviously is very well known across Canada and even in a lot of other countries for the Calgary Stampede. And we've got that kind of like Western quality. I mean, even if you go to the airport, like everyone is wearing cowboy hats, like the saddle dome is like the shape of a saddle. So it's like very much ingrained in our culture, right? And I think sometimes I've definitely heard people refer to Calgary as sort of being like the Dallas of Canada, or even Alberta being sort of the Texas of Canada. And I think that that's definitely in reference to the fact that the Calgary Stampede is such a huge thing, that this sort of like country aesthetic is very prominent here. And then also, you know, the emphasis on the oil and gas sector, like it is very reminiscent of Texas. But I think sometimes that does sort of give off the impression that Calgary might be a little bit like looks back a little bit instead of looking forward. And I feel like though, like what Andrew said, like there's definitely potential to lean into that a little bit. Like people also refer to Calgary as being a big city with a small town mentality. And I think that that could actually have the potential to be something that I think Calgary could really lean into. And yeah, there's definitely a lot of potential there. I think that I really enjoy Calgary Stampede, but I do also think that there are some elements of it that maybe if it was more like accessible to different kinds of people, like for example, the rodeo, like I've always wanted to go to the rodeo, but it's so expensive. Like, and a lot of other activities at the Calgary Stampede are kind of like behind a paywall. So maybe like if those are more accessible to like different kinds of people, that there would be more of a sort of like embrace of it as a part of our culture. But yeah, that's kind of what I think about it.
So what are the challenges around this is our lack of good data, right? We have the Tourism Calgary research that they contracted in 2007, ran over a 2-year period. It's fantastic data. There's some comparative data in there, but some of the more recent data, and I referred to it on the last meeting in our both papers, the City of Calgary's Attitudes and Outlook survey that looked at specifically a cohort of 18 to 24-year-olds, start amplifying or at least raising concerns of some of those leading indicators, right? 24% of people under the age of 24 think Calgary's dull, right? 27% intend to leave within 5 years. Other data points outside of that research that suggest, I believe the data point, this is American data, but I'm going to amplify it and say, you know, intuitively for Gen Z, it's not a bad data point that says 65, if I recall, 65 to 70% of Gen Z said fossil fuels are their parents' fuel. And 60% said they would have no intention of ever working in that sector. Right. So you start looking at some of these kind of macro issues that have been anchored to our city's identity for real reasons, because that is authentic. And they contradict the social and core values of young people in regards to professional opportunities, in regards to environmental opportunities, social values tied to, you know, in our paper, we emphasize Calgary's a diverse city, but I don't see data that suggests Calgary's an inclusive city. And those are two fundamentally different things. I believe diversity is a requirement to be an inclusive city, but we're not there yet. So Matt, let me jump over to you just on that kind of rambling narrative of man, the data is inconclusive. I don't know if the 27% is good or bad. I don't know if the 24% is good or bad, because I don't know what it's like in Vancouver or Toronto. What's your take on that today?
It's an interesting conundrum, because there's a little bit of an element of experience that's required. We were talking about earlier, and every brand that we can think of, and even our community, is reliant on people knowing those experiences exist. So even you refer to those social indicators, and Calgarians not necessarily saying it's dull or whatever perception they have. A lot of that is the challenge with it is that Calgarians as a community are just beginning to explore the potential of our city. There's so many things that our community has begun to evolve towards. So I think about 5 years ago, even this kind of conversation would not have been taking place. I think about the work that Colin and his team at Calgary on Purpose are doing. Those aren't conversations that would have been happening 5 years ago. And part of that is because of the transformation you talked about earlier. So when we do a ton of focus groups or research or any kind of survey, the number of times that we get back that says, wow, I'm actually surprised. The average Calgarian interacting with the Stampede, as an example, we all know the Stampede or think we do. But when we find out they're the largest funders of performing arts programs for youth in the community, everybody goes, what? Or we find out about the quality of arts programs, or we find out about the active experiences that are beginning to bind our community as well. We actually don't know. And so we begin to identify ourselves by what other people say. And you think about how Calgary is defined in external markets. Outside of all of those things, which nobody will talk about, how are we defined? We're defined by what a newspaper, somebody who buys ink by the barrel in Toronto will say about Calgary. And all of those are going to either do with how we don't look like or sound like people in Ontario, or economic. Well, those are really narrow definitions. And we haven't armed ourselves. Andrew was talking about this too. We haven't given ourselves permission to speak up. I don't think we actually even invited Calgarians to say, hey, right? And we don't know. I think there's a ton of opportunity in the city that we're just not even aware of. I know that there are young people leaving. Young people leave every city, and mobility is not new. It happens everywhere. But we often forget at the same time that Calgary was probably the biggest intaker of talent that this country has ever seen for a 20-year period. Well, that doesn't happen by accident. So what worked then, and how do we replicate that in a way that's relevant now, is probably one of the questions that I think are going to be really important for us to fix our reputation.
And I'll go with you on that one element. I think there was the almighty dollar was a magnet for 20 years, right?
Absolutely. Opportunity. And that's the interesting part about it, is I think about the opportunity. I've been doing lots of talking and thinking about this question, and we have different opportunities available now. Our post-secondary institution for 20 years have trained spectacular engineering geologists for a sector. We're just beginning to create new opportunities in different sectors. And are we training the young people to match those? And are we making our own people aware of it? The way we post an opening entry-level job for a tech sector, and really what we're looking for is 5 to 10 years experience. So we need to start making people aware of those opportunities, and then also creating the confidence in our own people to start connecting with them, right? There is and you know this from the experience economy research, and I won't ramble, but this is a really challenged market right now where the confidence has been shaken. When you see a historic drop in price of oil, a pandemic, economic restructuring, we're not quite sure how to think about it. So we need a bit of a boost. And that's what I find interesting with the conversation, is there are other people out there, but we need to keep exploring. It's good to challenge those ideas and quit defining ourselves by one thing or another and elevate those attributes. We can be diverse and talk about culture. We can talk about inclusivity, but we can also be diverse in terms of the things that we do, right? And how we think and what we say and what we see as an opportunity.
So Cassandra, let me ask you this question. One of the things we did in the paper, and we built it on a lot of the Tourism Calgary research, and then we overlaid other data points on it, is this authenticity versus aspirational dimension. And when we sent it out for reviewers for comment, we got some pushback because what we said was authenticity is about building brand trust, and as a marketer and a salesperson, my background, we've all put, or at least in my world, the term is lipstick on a pig, right? So you're trying to polish something up and turn it into something what it's not, to sell it, right? And that's where you're starting to look at this divide between authenticity and the aspiration, right? And then when we looked at the data and that table at the end of the paper, we looked at it by an audience specific. We said, you know what, I believe it was 16 brand attributes that were identified through the multiple studies. Obviously, a brand can't have 16 attributes, but we pulled them out, and I believe the current 2019 model framework, I believe, has 5, if I recall. And then we said, are they authentic? What's the evidence of it actually being true? And we said, I believe the number was somewhere around 72% or 75% of the brand attributes proposed in the new brand model, and from that study said, we think 3/4 are authentic and 1/4 are aspirational. And then we said, what's the perception of people outside of Calgary? And that, I think the number was about 59% believe it's authentic versus aspirational. What about Calgarians? 56% believed those brand attributes were authentic, not aspirational. And then we had the team of young people say, how about your lens? And it dropped to 31% believe that there was truth in the brand attributes, which is a 41% gap between what we judged were authentic. So they're not believing what we're selling, right? That's not a bad place to be, because the worst place to be is not actually having authenticity and having to build authenticity concurrently to building perception, right? So Cassandra, what about that question of the gap between assets and people not believing, specifically this young cohort, the assets exist?
Well, like it's such a fascinating discussion, David. And I think, you know, the other thing that the paper talked about that I thought was great was the fact that there's no silver bullet here. And so we need to find those commonalities, because we can be both, and we can be Stampede, and we can be young, and right, and still take into consideration that history that we have. And so I think that because we have such a diverse population, and we have so many young people, and we have everyone else as well, we need to find those commonalities, because something can be true for me that's not true for Andrew, or vice versa. And so how do we bridge that gap to let both things be true about our city, so that they can be authentic? And also, you know, to the point about authenticity, I think that, or sorry, aspiration. I think aspiration is a great thing, because if we're not aspiring to be more, then we become complacent. And then what is authentic today maybe doesn't resonate down the road. And so I don't have a problem personally with aspirational being part of it. I certainly think it needs to be very, very mixed with the what's true, but I think aspiration is a good thing.
So I'm gonna, I agree. I think aspiration's a good thing, but you know, and again, I would defer people to look at people work like the Edelman Trust Barometer work, because the risk of aspiration, or being, again, the lipstick on a pig, is you start risking the fundamental brand trust. If you start pretending you are something you're not, and I want to pull out a couple of assets that emerged in the research that I believe are risk areas, is that issue of we're diverse but not inclusive. So projecting us to be this all welcoming, inclusive city until you look at the board level data and realize, what the hell, we're not inclusive if you just look at board memberships. Or if we're not, if you look at some of the data point around issues around climate and the environment. If we pretend or want to project world leaderships on that, and then we look at reality, there are some gaps there, right? And the risk at that point is compromising. No one's going to believe what you're selling at that point if you push that aspiration too far. So Shatine, I want to ask you this question. I want this question of authenticity versus aspiration, you know, and the risk amongst young people not believing what we're selling, whether, again, reputation isn't about fact, it's about belief, right? Underlying the fact is almost secondary to the what you believe it is. What's your take on that, Shatine, in regards to, man, you know, there's a cohort of people that just aren't believing what we're selling, and it's getting worse or it's getting better?
Yeah, when I was reading the paper, actually the Why Calgary paper, I was really shocked to see that like over 30% of Calgary is like a racialized minority. I've lived here like my whole life, and like I probably wouldn't have guessed that beforehand. And I know that I feel like if I felt that way, then there's probably a lot of people in Calgary as well who maybe don't really fully realize just how diverse this city is. And you made a really good point that there's a difference between diversity and inclusion, right? Like it's one thing to say you're diverse, another thing to put action behind it. And I think sometimes the contention might come sometimes from, well, just as one example, I know that a lot of my friends who have chosen to leave Calgary, a lot of them say that like there seems to be a lot of talk about, for example, land acknowledgements and truth and reconciliation in Alberta and respecting Indigenous land and cultures. But then it kind of, it almost seems like the complete opposite of a lot of the economic endeavors in Calgary. It's so focused on oil and gas and pipelines and that kind of thing. And sometimes that can make it seem to people that it just doesn't seem very authentic to, for the city to make it seem like there's this emphasis on truth and reconciliation and Indigenous communities and land, but so much of our economic policies kind of go against that. And just things like that, I think sometimes make people view Calgary as kind of performative in its diversity initiatives instead of actually being authentic. So yeah, it's definitely, but I think that what Matthew said about how a lot of Calgarians just don't really know like what we have here is definitely a really good point, because until Calgarians sort of embody that, and until Calgarians genuinely feel like this is an inclusive city and it's progressive and it's forward looking, then no one else is going to believe it either. So
and let me build on something which Shatine was talking about. I think what we need to focus on, this is the marketer in me saying, we got two distinct segments here. And there's a zillion segments, but two distinct. One is Calgarians, right? And we've got 1.4-ish million of us, right? And if they're not believing what we're selling, right, or especially the younger mobile talent portion of it, how the hell are we going to turn somebody that's sitting currently in Toronto, Vancouver, or New York to say, oh yeah, this is the place to be, right? That seems like an exponentially harder sell. The marketer in me, and Matt, you appreciate this, is you got this. Job one is actually about retention and loyalty of the existing customers you have. Job two is about acquiring new, because that's exponentially more expensive and far more difficult, acquiring new customers. So Andrew, let me kind of put that marketing hat on you for a second and say, let's talk about retention and that idea of how do we turn, and it's going to kind of circle back to the kind of our last conversation on this issue. How do we overcome this perception challenge of the people who are sitting here already? And forget about the people in Vancouver, Victoria, that just see, F-150s and pipelines when they think of Calgary. How about somebody sitting in Calgary that in fact thinks that?
Yeah, good point. I was gonna say you can like put a gloss over anything when you sell it to another place, right? Like you can make, it's kind of like Jason Kenney's video when he was trying to entice the NHL to play their games in Edmonton. It's like, look how beautiful it is here, but it's like mountains and clean water and fresh air and all these wonderful things. So you don't really necessarily need to like match all the aspirations, I guess. But you're right. Like people are talking about that in the chat, like the best ambassadors of the city that you are in are the people who live in that city, right? And I think it's more, I wrote down, because there are the 16 things, and I wrote down 3 things that I think would help build, make people feel more connected to the city. I put introspective, open-minded, and friendly. I know people might be upset about the whole friendly thing because we're friendly Calgarians, but I mean, like, not, there's nice, which is what we are, nice and polite, and then there's friendly, being like, hey neighbor, how is it going? How's your job? How's your life? And all that stuff. Introspective and open-minded this is why I think there's that gap between young people and the rest, right? They see things that are happening. There's this idea that Calgarians, or Calgary is diverse, inclusive, progressive. It's city progressive in that sense, but they don't see it being reflected in the decisions that are made, like politically. They don't see it matching, their own opportunities. So I think when we think this is something that's aspirational, it's more like it's a fantastical, mythical idea of what we want Calgary to be, rather than what it actually is. And I think young people are perhaps just cynical about that. They know they have a different expectation, right? Maybe they've traveled to other world cities and came back and be like, damn, why don't we have like the subway that comes by every 2 minutes or every 30 seconds, So it is, I think, they've seen what is possible, and then become close to matching that in some kind of political decision, and then it gets taken away. And I think that's why there's that disbelief that this is not the way it really is. How do we change that? I mean, like, it comes from leadership. It comes from vision. We have to see, I mean, like, the people who are in charge have to show us that this is what they want, like, and reflect what young people want. And if that's the case, if there is more opportunities in oil and gas, then they'll reach out to their friends in other places and say, move to Calgary. There's another, like, we need, I don't know, programmers, coders. We need people to run those things. It's not just oil and gas anymore. So that's really what I think. Yeah.
So one of the challenges, so Matt, let me bounce back to you, man. One of the challenges that we raise, and it's a common theme in 3 papers we've written around this broad topic, is a concern of accountability, right? The last forum we said the Calgary needs a chief talent officer, because we say our people are the most important asset, and then we actually don't put the infrastructures to in fact operationalize that. And my analogy was, we're like a company that says our people matter, but we don't have a VP of HR, Human Resources Department. I see when we started looking at the issue of branding and looking at quote unquote best practices globally, there was a question of, in any organization that has ever had a brand knows, there needs to be accountability. You can't have 6 people who are brand managers responsible for a single brand, or you don't have a brand manager, right? I always say the minute 5 people are accountable for something, no one's accountable for it. This is one of the challenges we have in the city, though we have incredible civic groups. Tourism Calgary, I'm going to put on that, certainly on that list, obviously Calgary Economic Development, but then there's the other organizations like Calgary on Purpose, the City of Calgary, Capital City Corporation. There's all these people that have a piece of the pie, right? But that leads to a lack of accountability of who's the quote unquote chief storyteller. That is what, for example, Todd Babiak is for tourism, a brand Tasmania. He calls himself the chief storyteller, somebody that kind of lays out that narrative, and then the other people then can contextualize it for their needs, whether it be tourism or tech or education. What's the challenge? How do we get past the Calgary needs a new narrative to actually creating some accountability for that new narrative, Matt?
Yeah, and it's a good point. I get tired of the conversation to be blown with you. Calgary needs a new narrative when we can't even invest in the narrative we have already. Fact is there's an interesting political culture here that permeates into how we spend. And I don't mean political as in big P political, but also small p political. Politically, at the provincial level, we've been defining ourselves by how we keep our financial affairs and the pride in being debt free. Well, if you make all your decisions by that, then we're going to be very good operators, but not really good at anything else. But there is also the way that we treat and tell stories politically in other ways. And our community is just coming out of it and coming into an awakening about this. And what I mean by that is, for years, we've been framed by an energy industry who is they're incredible operators, they're incredible scientists, they're great engineers, but let's be blunt, they're not very good marketers. And in order to get a story out there, to get some consistency, we need to actually have a voice in the first place. What I find interesting is on average in consumer packaged goods, you would know this. They say, to get a good brand out there, you need to spend about 24% of your budget on marketing. In tech and services, it's about 15. I think I looked at a Deloitte study recently. On average, tech services, and they're spending 15%. And the energy industry, the average was 4%. We've adopted a similar mantra up until recently in Calgary. So what I find interesting about this whole accountability is I think it's an interesting idea, but I want to see what's happening with the stories that have already started to be told. So I think about the work that I'm going to pick on Cassandra, right? That's the Spirit and Sharing the Spirit campaigns. They embody a lot of these aspirational and authentic views. CED's campaign, right? But we're not really supporting them. We're not throwing real money at that to say, hey, we've all got different voices out there. The fact is that we're whispering in a windstorm when it tries to share our story, right? And I think that the conversation that we're having right now is interesting in that We have a story that we're only slightly willing to tell, that we need to start telling more of. We need to be consistent, absolutely, but every Calgarian needs to see themselves in it. And part of the tension that we're all bouncing around on today is that we've got a bit of a culture clash tension going on, where we've got a young generation of millennials who are now the largest part of our society and turning 40. They're not young anymore. And we've got generations behind them that have a different way of seeing things. And that's great. We also have new Calgarians who have a different way of seeing things. And we have new industries who have different ways of seeing things. And all of these things are at odds with our political structure, but also how we operate. And it doesn't mean that they're not working. I think they are. I think we just have to give them a bit more of a chance to start investing in it to make it work. Because I'd love to see what would happen if we gave some marketing like live tech, love life, and that's the spirit. Let's give it $3 or $4 million and actually push against that message to see what happens. Because I don't want to look at another survey from an external market where people in Regina say their city's way more diverse than Calgary's. I might pull my own hair out because it's just not true. Or say that Calgary doesn't have an arts and culture scene or isn't active or pollutes the environment. I just want to pull my hair out. We say we're doers and we got a generation of people coming who want to do, but we say no to the Olympics. And we need to go and we want to do it. We got a tech industry who can solve all sorts of great things, but we have to ask them. We got young people, we got to ask them. Let's give our people permission to give those ideas and then start really talking. Sorry, I could go on. I'm passionate about this. I think that's part of the story.
I think you need to crack a beer, man. Cassandra, I'm bang on with Matt in regards to, branding and marketing is about weight, frequency, stimulating recall. Like has been the mediums have changed, but the methods haven't changed for truly 100 years. Put some, you trigger, you throw weight behind it, you trigger the frequency, and you trigger recall. And I'm with Matt that there's whispering in a windstorm here, and the windstorm is now turning into a tornado, right, in regards to some of the key messaging. And what I see, and this is not unique to any civic organization, because it's also the responsibility of the companies that are based here have to be part of that amplification process. Like it's not one organization that has to be pounding it. It's everyone who says, I need to recruit people. I need to be part of a broader narrative. Right now, it's Adabotics or Benevity or Righteous Gelato or whoever trying to recruit people individually, tell them their individual story without anchor to a bigger story, right? That's how great brands are built, right? They have people amplifying and modifying. How do we turn all those organizations with dollars, with real dollars, to be part of this campaign to push it out that doesn't compromise their own individual goals, because that is first and foremost, but they can anchor to a more cohesive narrative that creates frequency and weight essential for storytelling?
Yeah, I mean, $1 million question, David. I think that, it starts with inviting everybody to the table and building that cohort of groups who want to tell that story and who can tell it. And I guess the other piece of it is it comes down to trust, right? And so if we don't trust what they're saying, then it doesn't matter what they're saying, right? As we've been talking about with the authenticity piece. And so it's bringing those groups that do have the trusted voice, and who want to be those champions and ambassadors and tell that story and get everybody going in the same direction.
So I'm gonna flip slightly on this one. I think we're all gonna have an opinion, and God knows there's gonna be 85 people on this call with this opinion. And it was a tweet that Councillor Gondek sent out about 2 weeks ago when the provincial government made some fairly structural budgetary cuts to the city of Calgary. And one of her comments in that process was the liability of the Alberta brand. And I've talked about this before as well, is the Alberta brand an asset or is it a liability? And if you look at, we talk about Texas, and this is why we built Austin into the case study, because Austin has systemically built themselves as a very independent brand outside of Texas, right? Keep Austin weird, right? And when you think of Austin, you think of South by Southwest. you think of something very different than you think of Houston or Dallas, the Cowboys, right? And it's a really interesting strategy. Now, it's not easily done, and there's certainly done on the corporate side. This is the house of brand versus a branded house issue. But what about the ability, Shatine, and I'll start with Shatine and move to Andrew. What's the role of the Alberta brand as being an asset or a liability, especially if at this moment in time they're not aligned? You've got, on some core social issues, economic, social, and otherwise, you've got clear divergence happening. And if you're sitting from a million miles away, and your perspective of Calgary is what Jason Kenney just said, right? And that makes your judgment call of whether I want to move there. That's a liability, not an asset often, right? So how do we deal with that? Because that is a ridiculously complex and politically sensitive issue, but it's not a unique issue. We could talk Berlin. Tasmania is an example that has structurally distanced themselves from the Australian brand for reasons, right? How do we deal with that? How is the Alberta brand an asset, Shatine, or is it a potential liability going forward?
I would say probably, in my opinion, I think the Alberta brand as it is right now is probably a little bit of a liability, only because like a lot of the times when I feel frustrated and I want to like go to Toronto or something, I usually remind myself that I actually enjoy like being in Calgary, but it's just that I don't really enjoy sometimes the politics of Alberta as much as I do like being Calgarian. And I definitely think that there is like a little bit of a contrast when it comes to the culture in Calgary versus the culture in Alberta. I mean, of course, like some things are kind of like the same throughout, like maybe the more cowboy side or the more environmental side. Like I feel like that's kind of pervasive like throughout Alberta, but there are so many organizations, for example, in Calgary that really champion diversity and inclusion and progress and all these things that sometimes are just, when you speak to people from like smaller towns in Alberta, that's just not really their lived experience. So I'm not really sure like how we would move away from that. But I definitely recognize that it is like, it's real, it's true. And that I do feel like Calgary probably has the potential to sort of distance itself from the larger Alberta narrative, but also I feel bad saying that because I don't know. I feel bad saying it, but it is true. Like I think the Alberta brand is like a little bit of a liability.
So Andrew, let me ask this question, and this is moving into kind of politically sensitive areas, but I think this is a fascinating conversation. So the classic firewall letter of 2007, if I recall, or maybe even earlier than that, from Stephen Harper and so forth, that said Alberta needs to create a firewall from Canada, right? So if we look at that from a pure branding perspective, that was social and politically driven issues around specific parts of operational rules of government. Does Calgary need to pull an Austin or pull a Tasmania or other places that say, no, we need to strengthen our independent of identity, and we can do that independent of Alberta because we say education is critical, and guess what? There's not a single person in this city that really has a whole lot of influence on whether they're going to cut post-secondary funding to education. So we say it at a city level, and then somebody else acts differently. What about that, Andrew? What's your view on that? That should Calgary create its, build its, Alberta independence? I don't mean that in a political sense, brand from an Alberta brand.
Like do what Edmonton did? Like, I mean, a firewall around the province. Does that sound welcoming and friendly, right? Like we're talking about Alberta welcoming the world for all this. They don't want to host the Olympics. They don't want to host X Games. They want to build a firewall. Like absolutely, like 100%. There's a liability in like about Alberta's brand. And I have to be very careful because Apathy is Boring as a nonpartisan organization, and I can't say anything that makes it sound like I dislike a government of any level. But anyway. like there is 100% a liability. Like Calgary is not Alberta, Calgary is not Edmonton, Calgary is not Lethbridge, right? And Calgary is definitely more than what people think it is. And what's hard is that it's so the conservative brand, that like the progressive conservative brand, was built here in Calgary, and it's so tied to the city, right? Like you would think, we've seen things like overwhelming majority of people support gay marriage, they support gay rights, they support Black Lives Matter is okay. It's touchy, but like they're very progressive. Where like the city is very progressive, but then they vote conservative, which like I don't know what's going on, this kind of divide there. But it doesn't help, right? It doesn't help Calgary's image to, at the end of a night, let's say you're trying to attract people from Toronto and Montreal and Vancouver, not Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, who are like covered in red, right? Covered in liberal red, and then Calgary is covered in blue. And so despite how forward and progressive we actually are in trying to, first Muslim mayor, lots of milestones happen in Calgary. They don't see that, right? They see the map at the end of the night that's awash in blue, and that must be what Calgary is, and there's no changing that.
Yeah. Kind of like build off of that. I feel like sorry to interrupt here, but you just hit the nail like completely on the head, because I definitely feel that like the culture, like just on like general population level, is so progressive. Like before COVID, like when Pride was in person, it was so big. Like there's so many people that come out to Pride every single year, and even like the Black Lives Matter protest was so huge in Calgary. And like more often than not, when I speak to people in Calgary, like they have very liberal views on a lot of things. They are really into tech. They're really into all these different, new and emerging sectors. But yeah, it doesn't really make sense why so consistently Calgary seems to vote in opposition to a lot of those ideals. So I think that might be kind of where the friction sort of lies. And it might be kind of confusing to people who are considering moving here. Like, what do people really believe there? Like, what is really going on there?
Can I just add one more thing? Because like, sorry, Matt, because I've been waiting to read out these stats from Elections Alberta, and this could be a problem or an issue, right? So there are 382,000 youth in Alberta aged 18 to 24. Only 58% of them are registered to vote, and only 31% of them actually voted in the last election.
I voted. Made up, Gen Z, but I voted.
Yeah, I voted too. I'm not Gen Z, but I voted too. And so that's not the good stat. The good stat is if every single young person voted, they would make up 20% of the proportion of the votes, instead of what we actually got was 7%. So there's a huge gap between, what our representation between what young people, make up in this province and who's being sent to the legislature and city hall, probably.
If I could just add to that. David, I think part of the challenge that we're seeing is that you guys are both right. I think Steen and Andrew, you're exactly bang on. What you're showing is that political change does take time, and it sounds trite to say it, but the last election happened in a time where economic uncertainty was driving people's agenda. So people were concerned about where my next paycheck is going to come from. Not to say that's everything, and they vote in a party that appeases that. But keep in mind that before that, we had a government that matched a lot of those progressive views that we saw along large parts of our urban population, which we never had seen before. So does that mean that we've gone back to that conservatism? I don't think so. I think that this is typical of a community or even an organization in flux and in transition. It doesn't happen, and it's not permanent, and it takes time. So David, you went back to that question about brand, and I think you have to go back to, is the Alberta brand a hindrance? I think you have to go back to why people would choose a place to live. Nobody says, I'm going to go to Alberta for a job. Not anymore. They say, I want to go to Calgary for a job. So the question of Alberta brand being relevant or not, I don't think it matters. I think Travel Alberta is a great example. They're doing a great service in helping shift the brand of our province in a subtle way. But when it comes to decisions about why people are going to live in a certain place, We don't say we have a job in Alberta. We're hiring somebody from Toronto right now, and they're talking about this community. So it's a matter of saying, maybe like Cassandra said earlier, yes, and really just arm the organizations who have the stories to tell with the right resources to tell them, because they're telling them. We just have to give them voice, and then encourage our people to build that brand, because it's going to happen. Austin, New York, London, all these cities have great brands, but all of them happened by accident. It wasn't like New York was a t-shirt tourism that got catchy. Don't Mess with Texas was a littering campaign. These are all things that happened by accident, right? So let's be deliberate in giving the voice to the organizations that have it. And let's not worry about Alberta. That's somebody else's issue, and focus on our city, our community.
All right, perfect. We got 2 minutes. I'm going to do a quick kind of speed dial roundtable here. Matt, so got you. I'll let you start and we'll roll through it. 1 minute or less. You're now the chief brand officer for the city of Calgary. Job one.
Invest in it, period. Done. 10 seconds, finished.
All right, find money. Cass, you're the chief brand officer for the city of Calgary. What's the number one thing you do?
Well, I'm going to do job two because Matthew stole job one. So I think job two is getting representation at the table and bringing in the representation of real Calgary.
Of real Calgary, and that's key, right? Shatine.
I think the first thing that I would do is just make more transit lines, because I think that would go a long way to encouraging Calgarians to like actually explore the city. So
Perfect. Facilitate connectivity so people can explore their own town affordably and easily. Love it. Andrew, bring us home.
All of those things combined, specifically make Calgary more youth friendly. That is because we want to see, have them in positions at community associations, at boardrooms, at city hall, blah, 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 all that stuff. And we happen to have Apathy's Warring just relaunched a program called Youth Friendly to help organizations do that.
Perfect. Plug it, throw it in the chat so people know where it is, man. Okay, so we're at 5 o'clock. Thank you very much, everyone, our panelists for participating in a fantastic conversation. Thank you to the 80 plus people that sat on month 2. We have not defined what month 3 is going to be. I'm going to give that a thinking about some of the themes that emerged today and look at what that topic may be. But please re-engage. This is only the start of the conversation. This is not an academic exercise. Our purpose here as a community is to actually start mobilizing and having a difference. And so it's going to take all of us to have that impact. So I want to thank you everyone for participating. I want to thank our panelists, Cassandra, Matt, Andrew, and Shatine for participating. Awesome work, guys. Great conversation. And onward. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everybody's gone.
I want to see the chat.